your formal remarks, Jim, you gave all sorts of mechanisms of how evolutionary change can take place. Sexual selection, natural selection, genetic drift, total of 8. None of those produce increasing complexity. They've never have. And you didn't even allude to it. They produce change. They produce changes in gene frequency, which you pointed out, but none of them produce increasing complexity. That's what's got to happen. If you're going to start at the bottom of this evolutionary tree, let's assume somehow that first bacteria came into existence. Somehow. How do you get from that bacteria up to a human? You've got some incredible complex things. How do you come up with the immune system of a living thing? Because if that immune system isn't complete in an organism, almost at once, the organism is going to get zapped by the first bacteria, viruses, or toxins that hit it. And then it's dead, and all the nice trials to come up with a good immune system are out the window. So you've got a lot of complexity, and you haven't even begun to touch it. You did something that was kind of interesting. You kind of defined creation out of the science picture. That's a nice game to play if you're in a competition with somebody. Let's say the Minnesota Vikings are going to play the Green Bay Packers. And if somehow one of those teams can define the other out of existence, they win. And Jim Fetzer wants to define creation as being non-science, so all that's left is evolution. And I certainly presented scientific evidence, things that you can see, measure, and others can check. And you presented practically no scientific evidence to support the idea of increasing complexity, or how the solar system evolved, or how the moon evolved. There's a book that I mentioned to you that I said I might discuss with you, and I'm going to. It's just out. It's produced by one of the, Simon & Schuster, very respected secular publisher, and it's called Darwin's Black Box, written by Michael Behe. He's a professor of biology at Lehigh University. He's a biochemist. And here's what he means by Darwin's black box. He said Charles Darwin didn't know what we knew today. He could look deeply. He was a perceptive individual. And as he looked into the details of living things, there were things that he couldn't see the details of. So he considered them basically as black boxes. A living cell was an example of one of his black boxes. But what Behe has said, now remember he's a biochemist, as you look to more and more finer, smaller things, what goes on in life suddenly becomes a little bit of chemistry. And he says the living cell is so complex. Now here's a man, he's not a creationist. He said the living cell is so complex there must be an intelligent designer. It's got to be. And when you talk about that bacterial motor, there's obviously got to be a designer. If somebody thought a motor, even an inefficient motor like a motor that we might have, came about by natural processes, you'd be laughed out of the room. If you thought a computer could come about by natural processes, you'd be laughed out of the room. It takes lots of creativity. Well, Behe goes through many, many systems to argue the point that there's got to be an intelligent creator. Now, he's not going to say who that creator is. In fact, not because it's getting into religion. He says, I just don't know scientifically. But he says there's certainly an intelligence, a super intelligence to put things together. He talks about metabolic pathways, all the sequence of steps that our bodies and every living thing has to take in order to convert food to energy. There are many chains of events that would have to occur, and if they didn't all occur at the same time, you wouldn't be able to convert food to energy. He goes into the blood clotting process. Our bodies are vessels. They contain a liquid. And anytime you have a vessel with a liquid in it, you puncture it, you run the risk of draining that vessel. Well, that would be terrible if that happened to us. So we've got to have some system in our bodies to clot the blood. But the clotting process has got to be very, very specific. You don't want to clot blood inside your body because it could cause a heart attack. When you clot something, you want it to break off once the skin heals. And what is now known, because of biochemistry, is that there are some 30 different kinds of proteins that are in a cascading sequence of events that have to be there working just properly. This one triggering this one turning off that one, this one and this one triggering that. 30 of these sequences in order for blood to clot properly. And if one of them is off, you've got a hemophiliac or you've got a heart attack. And so obviously, how could all of those 30 complex proteins are very complex devices, how could they all come about in any gradual, sequential manner? They couldn't. All the capability has got to be there at once. And that argues for an intelligent designer. He goes into many other systems. The genetic material that we were talking about. It turns out this 7.5-foot tape of genetic material that is roughly the equivalent of 4,000 volumes. That's Carl Sagan's estimate. I concur with his estimate, by the way. Information doesn't self-assemble, I mentioned that. But also, that genetic material is coded. And what is a code? A code is a set of rules for converting information from one useful form to the other. Morse code is an example. Dots and dashes, alphabetical letters. You've got to be able to go back and forth. Braille is another example of a code. But think about what it takes to form a code. You've got to understand a system of information processing, like alphabetical letters, and you've got to understand dots and dashes. And natural processes will not produce codes. I've never seen a natural process produce code. I'd love to ask you, but your time, I'm sorry, is up. And so you have no need. I'm sorry?
The gods must be smiling upon me tonight, Walt. They've given me 3 minutes and 34 seconds. May I take a few of those? We'd like to observe that Walt says a number of things about evolution that are not all wrong, but the most interesting one, of course, where he's basically right, is the idea that man descended from a common ancestor with apes. And here we have it from Charles Darwin himself, who observes in so many words that man is descended from a hairy quadruped, four-legged creature, furnished with a tail and pointed ears, probably arboreal, meaning, a night creature in its habits and an inhabitant of the old world, and goes on and on. So it's certainly true that when Walt suggests that Darwin implied that we're common genetic relatives with creatures of this kind, that he was right on. And in fact, it's fascinating to realize, as Lumsden and Wilson in a fascinating book have pointed out, that we share more than 98% of our genes with chimpanzees. More than 98% of our genes are shared with chimpanzees. Now that implies that less than 2% of our genes that we do not share with chimpanzees are a pretty important 2%. And I tell you, the only way you want to understand this, or can't adequately understand it, is to recognize the role of polygenic and pleiotropic effects, where a small number of changes in genes can make a tremendous difference in the phenotypical characteristics of an organism.
This idea of 90% commonality, I've heard 99% commonality of our genes with apes, is ridiculous. We don't know what the genetic component nucleotide by nucleotide is for the human. That's an ongoing project, the Genome Project, very expensive. One of the biggest projects the field of biology has ever undertaken, let alone what the genetic component of an ape is. Now here's how that confusion, I think, got started. There are certain proteins, cytochrome C is one of them, and I've done a lot of study of cytochrome C, in which the sequence of amino acids in cytochrome C can be enumerated. And the same with the human. And sure enough, there is 99% commonality between the human cytochrome C sequence and that of the rhesus monkey. But that's because cytochrome C is used for the same function in both forms of life. There are many differences in apes and humans. The reproductive systems are completely different. The brains are completely different. So this story keeps being repeated. I've heard it on television, 99%, 97% commonality. That's just, frankly, ridiculous.
Walt, you talk a good game, but the evidence doesn't support it. Let me invite everyone's attention to a marvelous book by Merlin Donald entitled Origins of the Modern Mind, where Merlin Donald very patiently displays the neurophysiological evidence, a commonality between human beings and gorillas and other members of the great apes. If you want to ask for the basis of this genetic comparison, it's right there on the overhead. These are the chromosomes all along the outside, and they display a great deal of knowledge about the DNA and other characteristics of chimpanzees in relation to human beings. This is hardly an area in which we don't possess a huge amount of knowledge, and the fact that the human genome, or all of the genes that affect the human phenotype, have not been completely mapped as an ongoing project does not undermine the fact that there's been a huge amount discovered and known about human DNA and human genes, more than sufficient to support this generalization about the degree of similarity between ourselves and chimpanzees.
Well, if you admit that we certainly don't know the genetic complement of the ape, then I think you'll agree with me. There's no basis for you coming up with this 97%. But back to cytochrome C. Cytochrome C exists, it's a protein. It exists in all forms of life, bacteria, humans, plants, animals. There have been a number of studies with that, because it's so easy to sequence it relatively, that they can see how many mutations it would take to convert form of life A to form of life B. And if evolution happened, you would expect, if the genetic distance between two forms of life is short, you would expect they would be related. Well, those sort of studies have turned up some very embarrassing contradictions. It turns out, yes, it's true that the rhesus monkey has 99% commonality with the human. But the snake is most closely related to the human. And the plant kingdom is most closely related to the rhesus monkey. And there are so many contradictions. I could read you lots of statements by leading authorities. Dr. Colin Patterson has done some of these experiments and said, I've precisely falsified evolution based upon it. So you would expect the reptiles to be all closely related, but as I say, the snake is most closely related to the human. And some of you may say, I understand that. I know some humans that remind me of snakes. But the point is, these studies don't support the theory of evolution. Now, you mentioned an interesting thing. You mentioned the 5 kingdoms. That's right, but that's a problem for you. The thought was, when you and I were going to school, that evolution would tend to fill in these gaps. But what has happened, as more detailed studies have taken place, we find greater and greater differences between different forms of life. For example, up until a few years ago, it could be said that all forms of life derive their energy from the sun. But lo and behold, on the ocean floor are found forms of life that derive their energy from chemicals. And very strange forms of life. And here in one ocean, the Pacific, you might find this form of life, and you find the same form of life over in the opposite part of the world. How can, so here you have a completely different energy system in two forms of life. How could one energy system have evolved from the other? It's like having your home be heated by electricity and trying to change one little wire at a time and get it to be a coal-burning home. You'd freeze in the winter. Won't work. The intermediate states are not stable. You'd go extinct.
Well, to take advantage of the minute I have left, there are another number of mistakes and confusions implicit in your observation. I mean, reclassification in a complex field of inquiry is a common phenomenon in science. It used to be believed in ancient times that there were only 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. But now we know, based on atomic theory, there are actually at least 103 basic elements. And ask yourself, on the face of it, would you have ever believed that everything there is in the universe could be made out of only 103 basic elements? Sounds inconceivable. But that's just because we were naive, you know. We haven't studied it. We don't know enough. That's largely the force of Walt's position. You don't know enough about evolution and genetics to realize how utterly plausible and responsible is the evolutionary account that gives a perfectly natural explanation for the emergence of many forms of life by means of purely mechanistic or naturalistic causal mechanisms such as those I've described.
The point is, you haven't described any mechanism by which new complexity comes about. You've thrown around a lot of terms, but you haven't given one example of how the offspring of a plant or animal can have increasing complexity. And if you think about it, you've got to come up with new organs. Changes in size, shape, color, or chemistry, that's obvious. That's the sort of thing that is produced by his 8 so-called mechanisms. That's microevolution. But to get new organs, new vital organs especially, one would wonder, even if you could make that leap, if it's a vital organ, you finally get a heart or something like that, how it could have lived without it. You mentioned a little while ago the horse series. Let me read for you what David Raup, at the time he wrote this. He was what he would call the dean of the Field Museum of Natural History, one of the leading natural history museums in the world, and the collection of fossils that they have is just immense. He said, well, it's now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much from the time of Darwin, when Darwin saw all these gaps and wondered how they could be filled if evolution happened. We now have 250,000 fossils. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have fewer examples of evolutionary transitions than we did in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded and modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice simple progression, which you have bought into, Jim, by the way, when relatively few data were available, now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic. So Darwin's problem has not been alleviated in the last 120 years, and we still have a record which does show change, but one that can hardly be looked upon as the most reasonable consequence of natural selection. Your horse example doesn't hold water.
I've only got 5 seconds, Walt. If I got to respond, I'm just going to point out. My wife and I were traveling cross-country to a professional meeting this summer, and the truck ahead of us had this written in the back of it, and I must say it's a highly intelligent observation.
But back to this genetic material. I was talking about codes, and I think it's obvious that you've got to have some intelligence to figure out how information can be useful in one form and how it can be converted to the other and back and forth. But that genetic material is also a program. It guides the function of the cell. What is a program? A program is a planned sequence of steps to produce some objective. And right there, I think you can see, to have a program Computer programs are a good example of programs. You've got to have some foresight into where you want to go. You've got to know what tools you've got, how you can put this together with that, or this line of code with that, and get something beneficial. It takes intelligence. Programs don't come about by natural process. I've never seen it. I've written thousands of computer programs myself, and I've never written a non-trivial program that's been right the first time, and I'm trying. So how in the world could you come up with programs, codes, and information by natural process? It just won't happen. I'm sorry you're out of time, but you've not given the mechanism for coming about with new complexity or new vital organs. Where are the billions of transitional fossils that should be there if all living creatures in the fossil record or both came about? Who are the evolutionary ancestors of the insects? That evolutionary tree that's in the textbook, where's its trunk and where are its branches? They're missing. What's the evidence that there's information such as in DNA that could ever self-assemble itself? How could an organ as complex as the eye evolve? You've got a lens, you've got hundreds of about 100 million sensors at the back of your eye that pick up photons of light. Some of them pick up it in Technicolor, some pick it up in black and white, rods and cones. How does something that complex come about? And then you've got those wires that are going from your rods and cones into the brain through an optical nerve, and they better attach to the right place or it's going to be a waste of time. You've got to get all the components working together or the whole thing's a waste of time. And the organism is carrying on all this additional baggage that's not going to work. And you might say, well, maybe it could happen once. Well, there are about 20 different types of eyes. Our eyes work with a lens. Some eyes work with mirrors. Some eyes work on a mosaic principle. Some eyes work with a television scanning principle. Some we see in 3 basic colors, the three primary colors. Some insects see in 17 colors. And what the evolutionists will often say, well, and what Darwin alluded to, and there's been no better answer that I've heard, is that, well, maybe there was a light-sensitive cell. And maybe that was the start of it. Well, right there, Michael Behe in his book says, wait a minute. Just to get a light-sensitive cell, look at what's in that cell. It is as complicated, that light-sensitive cell that you're hypothesizing, is as complicated as a Rolls-Royce. It's just not going to come about by natural processes. I wish I could have heard your views on how the solar system evolved. Or how stars evolve. Stars are, you've got to get a star forming, you've got to have lots of gas, and it's got to somehow collapse, but the temperatures of stars make it the gas go in the wrong direction. You've got to squeeze it down to a certain critical volume before gravity can take hold and pull it in. And by the way, one of your examples of gravity, you got it wrong. The law of gravity says that it's the product of the masses divided by the square of the distance between the two bodies. You didn't have it as the product of the mass. You just said the mass. And which came first? I mentioned that chicken and the egg problem, where you've got, in order, the DNA directs the function, the formation of all the proteins in your body. But your body, that DNA will not work unless those proteins are there. So you've got a chicken and the egg problem. This is, many scientists have said this is one of the key problems we have with our theory. And every now and then somebody will come and say, well, I've solved it. And the last time that happened, and by the way, they haven't solved it, a German doctoral student got his doctor's degree thinking he solved it. And just about a year ago, others had tried to duplicate it and found that they couldn't duplicate it. They went back to the man and turned out he had forged his data. And now the university's trying to take it away from him. That problem has not been solved. And it's a terrible dilemma for you. Sexual reproduction. You haven't even touched on that. How could sexual reproduction evolve? The textbooks don't talk about it. Let me read for you a couple of statements by one of the in Science magazine was a statement, but the sex determination genes in the fruit fly and the worm are completely unrelated to each other, let alone those of mammals. One of the leading books on sexual reproduction, written by George C. Williams, said that this book is written, first sentence in the book, this book is written from a conviction that the prevalence of sexual reproduction in higher plants and animals is inconsistent with current evolutionary theory. Inconsistent with it. Why don't the textbooks say that? Another statement in New Scientist. The evolution of sex is one of the major unsolved problems of biology. Even those with enough hubris to publish on the topic often freely admit that they have little idea how sex originated or is maintained. It is enough to give heart to the creationist. It is enough to give heart to the creationist. Another statement in Discover magazine. Indeed, the persistence of sex is one of the fundamental mysteries of evolutionary biology today. Statement in Omni. Sex is something of an embarrassment to evolutionary biology. These are evolutionists talking. They're not creationists. I wouldn't quote a creationist in here because they'd say I was biased. So I'll quote the evolutionists. They're talking scientific evidence when you read their paper. This is science. You can't define it out as being out of the realm of science. That's like saying the Vikings don't exist. Therefore, you win by default. And what I think he's confusing is the whole idea called the God of the gaps. The God of the gaps was an idea that scientists opposed from the time of Newton on, I believe. In fact, I think maybe Newton coined the term. And the idea is if you don't understand how something works, you can't say a creator did it. I agree with that. You have never heard me or seen anything that I've written where I try to explain something something that you don't understand how it happened by just saying, well, it was created that way. I've never done that. That's the God of the gaps. I oppose that. But when you see evidence, things that you can measure, see, and reproduce, and you see that it is consistent with a creator, like information, like sexual reproduction, like the clotting of blood, like the metabolic pathways, like bacterial motors, like a solar system that shouldn't have formed, like stars that some scientists have said that if we didn't know stars were there, we could easily prove they couldn't exist, then that is not the God of the gaps. That is hard science. And I think we need to bring it into the classroom. To not do that is censorship. And censorship is going on. And universities wouldn't hire a creationist because they would say they're unscientific. And that's just plain wrong. Here's another statement on sexual reproduction. So why is there sex? We do not have a compelling answer to the question. Despite some ingenious suggestions by orthodox Darwinians, there is no convincing Darwinian history for the emergence of sexual reproduction. Well, my time is up.
Yeah, by some fluke, I have a minute or two left, and I'd just like to address an issue that I believe is on the minds of many of you here as my closing observation. A very sincere letter appeared in the News Tribune quite recently by a woman from Two Harbors. And she was saying how she didn't believe in evolution and she believed in God. She thought there was a designer. In fact, she went so strongly as to say, I know that God created man in his own image and created the universe in 6 days. Now, I don't want to dispute her belief, which I'm sure she holds quite sincerely. I just want to make a comment about the meaning of the word knowledge. There's an ordinary use of the word knowledge as sincere belief. Without any question, she has a sincere belief that God created the world in 6 days and so forth. But there's a much stronger and more significant sense of the word knowledge, where knowledge is sincere belief supported by suitable evidence, observational, experimental, scientific, etc., satisfying appropriate standards for rationality of belief. And in that sense, she does not, cannot, nor can anyone else know that God created the universe in 6 days, because that's a belief that falls far beyond the confines and limits of scientific inquiry. On behalf of Walt and myself, I want to thank you all for this wonderful evening.